So now that we got started and you know what the course is about, the first thing we'll have to do in order to learn about tests and write tests is we have to set up a testing environment. We have to create a project where we have all the tools we need to run tests. And therefore, in this section, I will show you how such an example environment could look like, and I will walk you through the required tools and elements we need in such an environment. Of course, I will also show you an example setup. We'll use a couple of setups, but we'll have a base setup which we'll use for the course, and I'll show you that setup, and you will get all these setups from me. And I will also talk about various alternatives we have at certain points, different tools we could use for the same job, and why I'm choosing a certain tool for this course, but that what you learn in this course will apply in general no matter which setup you will later use in your projects. So let's dive into the testing setup you need. It all starts with the general application setup for your main application, for the main code you're writing, for the product you're building, even if you don't plan to add any testing. Because that's, of course, the main thing you do. You're building some product, some application, no matter if it's a Node.js or a React or any other kind of application, you're building something and you're writing code for that, and for that you have a project. Now, that is something you definitely need, no matter if you intend to add testing or not. And that is also where you can stop already if you don't want to add automated tests. If you only plan to test your code manually by clicking around in the demo website with the development server you might have, then that is all you need. And that is what you see in a lot of projects and what you most likely also did a lot in the past. In most of my other courses, we just have a project set up without any automated tests because I focus on the core topic at hand. In the React course, I have a React project without automated tests because I focus on React features and concepts, and we test everything manually in the demo website that we get with help of the development server there. But of course, in this course, we want to dive into automated tests, and therefore we need to enhance this project setup. And the good news here is that we can merge our testing setup and our testing configuration into this main project, as you will see later in this section. Now, your project setup without the testing parts will typically also already come with some configuration and some extra tools. For example, you might be using Webpack or Vite or Babel there to optimize and transform your code, and the exact setup depends on the project you have. And very often you don't create that project configuration on your own, but instead very often you use some tool like the Create React App tool or the Angular CLI to create a project for you that comes with a certain configuration out of the box so that you can focus on the actual code you write. So that is what you always have basically, because you need that to build a product, to build an application, to write code. But then if you want to add automated tests, you need extra tools that are added to this project. For example, you need to add a test runner. You also will need an assertion library typically. But what are these things? What are these tools? A test runner, as the name suggests, is a tool that actually executes your testing code. Because tests are also just code you write, but not code that belongs to your main application or product, but instead code that's there to test your other code. And that testing code should be executed by such a test runner because it's not part of your main application code. You don't execute it together with your main application code. Instead, you have a dedicated testing tool, a test runner tool, that executes your test code only during development. Such a test runner typically automatically detects your testing code as long as you place your testing code in certain files that follow a certain naming schema, but you will learn more about that later. The test runner then also is responsible for executing your tests, gathering the results of these tests, and displaying the results of these tests. And there are different test runner tools you could add. It depends on the programming language you're using, but then you also often got multiple alternatives for one and the same language. For example, for JavaScript tests, a popular test runner is Jest. Actually, Jest is more than just a test runner, but it also is capable of running tests. But Karma would be a popular alternative, though I will say that Jest became more popular over the past years. So that's one important part. But a test runner, as the name suggests, only executes your tests. You also, of course, need to then define what makes a test successful or not. So you don't just need to execute your testing code, but you also need some way of defining expectations, expected results, and what's treated as a success and what should be treated as a failure instead. And that's where an assertion library comes into play. Because with assertion libraries, you can define your expected outcomes, and the assertion library will then check if the code that's tested, if your testing code actually produces a result that matches those expectations. So whether your expectations are met. And good assertion libraries should, of course, support all kinds of possible outcomes and situations, including synchronous versus asynchronous code, and so on. Now, again, the tool you will choose depends on the programming language you're using, and even inside of one and the same language, like JavaScript, you have alternatives, like, for example, again, Jest for JavaScript or Chai. Now, as you can see on this slide already, Jest seems to be a tool that supports both aspects, which is of course great because it means you only need to install one tool and configure only one tool to get both important features you need for defining and running tests. So that's the overview of a testing setup of how it should look like and which tools are needed. In the next lectures, I will now walk you through an example project and an example setup, which also adds a test runner and an assertion library. And I will also explain why I'm actually not using Jest in this course, but instead a different tool, which, in my opinion, is even better and which is gaining a lot of traction lately. Now, I did already show you this example, and indeed using VTest in your project, no matter if it's a front-end project or a Node project, as I have it here, using it is as simple as running npm install --save-dev and then VTest. You run this command, this installs it into your JavaScript project. Again, no matter if it's Node.js or front-end JavaScript. And then with that installed, all you need to do is in your package.json file, you add the test script and you set the value either to just VTest or VTest ---- globals. The ---- globals flag just makes sure that you can use special functions like it or expect, about which you will learn more throughout this course, without any extra imports. But that is how easy it is to use VTest. Now, all that being said, I will provide you with projects where I already set up everything so that we can get started with testing, because this course is about learning to test and to write tests. It's not about learning how to configure different kinds of projects. Hence, I will provide them to you so that we can focus on the essentials here. Of course, if you want to learn more about VTest or about Jest, check out their official docs, check out the details you can learn there to dive really deeply into it. But with that, that's the kind of setup we're going to use in this course, and that's the kind of setup we're going to use to learn all about tests. So let's now explore the testing setup we'll use in this course and talk about various alternatives that we have. As mentioned before, it all starts with our application setup, with the project itself. And when it comes to that setup, it really does not matter which kind of application it is. It could be a simple Node Express or any other Node.js framework project. But it also could be a front-end JavaScript project, either with plain JavaScript, maybe combined with a bundler or a build tool like Vite or Webpack, which is very popular. But it could also be, of course, a React or an Angular project. It really does not matter. It's any kind of JavaScript project. It could also be a TypeScript project. Whatever it is, what you learn in this course will apply to that kind of project. The way you write tests and the idea behind writing tests will always be the same. Now, certain types of projects that might have been created with certain tools, for example, React projects that were created with Create React App, or Angular projects that were created with the Angular CLI, such kinds of projects typically already have a full testing workflow built in, and you can dive right into writing tests. And what you will learn in this course will help you with these kinds of projects as well, because the way you write tests, and actually also the code you write, is pretty much always the same. It would have to be a very specific kind of configuration or setup that those things would change, but even then, the general idea, the approach towards testing, and the logic that goes into your tests would still be the same. But of course, you also might have a project which you're creating from scratch on your own, especially if it's a Node.js backend project, but also for some frontend projects. You might not always have a predefined testing configuration and workflow. And as mentioned on this slide before, you then need such a test runner and such an assertion library, which you add to your project setup and which you configure such that it works in your project setup. If you use something like Create React App or the Angular CLI, they already pre-install and pre-configure these kinds of tools for you. If you're doing it manually, then, well, you have to do it manually. Now, you already see on this slide that Jest seems to be a very helpful tool because it's mentioned for both the test runner and assertion library category. And indeed, Jest is a very popular tool for testing, and you can use it with all kinds of projects, as you can see on their official website. There, if you dive into the documentation, you also learn how you can get started, and it is indeed super simple. Here's a very simple example where I installed Jest into a basic Node Express application. I then just added one file with a test in it. And of course, we're going to learn what all this code is all about and how this works and why I did write this code. But with that, I can just run npm test, since I configured my package.json file appropriately, and my test is executed. Again, we're going to learn all the details of what's happening here and what this command does throughout this course. But it's super simple to get started with Jest, and that's the reason why it is quite popular. But Jest also has its disadvantages and downsides. It can be a bit slow, and especially if you have a project that uses ES modules, so that uses not CommentJS, as I'm using it here, but that uses instead those import-export statements, which you know from a lot of front-end projects especially, but which you also can use with Node.js. If you're using these ES modules, this other kind of import-export syntax, then Jest kind of supports it. It does support ECMAScript modules, but support is only experimental. And in my experience, setting it up and making it work with this other import syntax can be very annoying, and you often end up installing extra tools, and you set up an extra workflow for testing where the code gets transpiled and changed behind the scenes, which is always a bit annoying. If your main code works just like that without any extra setup, and you then need some extra configuration just to make your tests work, that's not really the idea behind testing. You don't want to test something different than you run in production, even though it's just a behind-the-scenes transpilation. But still, Jest does have its downsides, even though it's very popular. Now, you absolutely can work around those downsides, but in this course, we're going to use vtest. It's a pretty new, pretty popular already tool, which also allows you to write tests, and it is compatible with Jest syntax. It has an API that allows you to write your tests in the same way you would write them for Jest, basically, plus some extra convenience features, which are really nice to have, and it works with ES modules out of the box. It also works with CommentJS though, so with this import syntax. And just to give you an example of how easy it is to use Jest, here's the exact same project as I showed you a couple of seconds ago with the same testing code. But now I swapped out Jest for vtest and changed the testing command. And with that done, I can still run npm test and I still run all my tests as before. So therefore, in this course, we're going to use vtest because it's a bit faster, it has this better ES modules support, and as you can see here, the code you write in your tests is the same as you would do for Jest. So the vast majority of what you learn in this course can be applied one-to-one in the same way in a Jest project. And you get this more modern tool behind the scenes to get all the advantages of this as well. So therefore, in this course, we're going to use vtest. And just like Jest, vtest is both a test runner and an assertion library. So we don't need any other extra setup. We can just use vtest for both. Now, as mentioned, for the next course sections, I already prepared some projects for you. Some projects which contain some dummy code, which we can use to write some tests for that code, but also some projects where I already installed vtest for you and set everything up such that we can just get started running those tests and you don't have to go through all the setup and installation process on your own. Now, attached you find a link that gives you 3 project folders, 3 demo project folders, which all produce the same website in the end, but which use different approaches. We have some backend and some frontend code in there, and we have different ways of achieving the final result of giving you a website which shows a basic calculator that you can use to calculate a number in the end. Now, every project is simply just a folder with a bunch of code files inside of it, and every folder has a package.json file which defines the dependencies of that project. Now, if you go through these package.json files, you will note that in all these package.json files, I'm installing vtest, but in 2 of the 3 package.json files, I also use Express as a dependency. These 2 projects here, basic testing Node.js and basic testing Node.js ES modules, are backend projects. They are Node Express apps, Node Express projects in the end. The other project, as the folder name already reveals, is a frontend application, so to say, and therefore here I don't install Express, I just have some development dependencies, for example a basic HTTP server which serves this index.html file which contains a basic form. And this file also imports app.js, which is a JavaScript file with some code that also imports other files. Now, regarding the imports, I want to mention that here in the frontend app, I am using ES modules, ECMAScript modules, so this import syntax here and this export syntax like this, which you might know from many projects. For example, from React projects, Angular projects. In all those projects, you typically use ECMAScript modules. And the browser supports this import-export syntax out of the box if you import your main script like this with the type equals module attribute. If that is brand new to you, you definitely want to check out some basic JavaScript resources first before diving deeper into this course. For example, my JavaScript The Complete Guide course, where I teach about this import syntax as well. For the Node projects, I have 2 different variants of one and the same app. For the basic testing Node.js app, I'm using the common.js import, which looks like this, which you most likely already know if you ever worked with Node before, because that is the default import syntax you know there, and the export syntax then looks like this. Alternatively, I could have also used module exports equals something, but that is how I could export multiple things from one file. But this is the syntax you should know if you worked with Node before. As a side note, for this course, you don't need to know Node.js. You don't need to fully understand all that code. You will still be able to understand all the testing parts. You should, of course, have some basic JavaScript knowledge, though. But this is regular Node.js code, I also got a different variant of that same project though, where I set the type setting here in package.json to module, and therefore here I then also use ES modules for importing and exporting. This also works here. This is supported by modern Node.js if you have a recent version of Node.js installed on your system, which you of course should do. Now here I then have the same app, but I'm using this different import-export syntax, which you also know from the front end. Now all three projects which we have here in the end give you the same kind of app. And we can see this in action if we open the terminal, for example, the terminal built into VS Code. And we then, for example, dive into the front-end project. There, you first of all need to run npm install to install all the dependencies. And for this, you also must have Node.js installed. And once you ran npm install here, you can run npm start in this front-end project. This starts a little development server in the end, which hosts this index.html file on localhost 8080. And if you open localhost 8080 in your browser, you will see something like this. By the way, I zoomed in quite a bit here, which is why it's that big for me. It will be smaller for you if you're not zooming in. There is no styling that would make it that big. Now here we get a basic calculator. If I don't enter anything, I get this error. If I enter valid numbers, I get the expected result though. Also if I'm using negative numbers. And if I manipulate this by using the browser developer tools, and I, for example, change the type of the input here from numeric to text so that I can enter something like hello here, then I also get an error message. Now that was the front-end application, but it's pretty much the same, just achieved differently behind the scenes for my Node.js applications. If you do navigate into the basic testing Node.js folder, and you run npm install in there to install all the dependencies, then you need to execute this app.js file here with Node by running node app.js. And this will then start a server, a Node.js server on port 3000, on localhost port 3000. And if you open that, you see the same as before, and it also has the same functionality as it did before. So that is really the same thing here. That is what we can see here in action. And the same would be true if you run the other Node app. If you navigate into the basic testing Node.js ES modules project and you run npm install there, once all dependencies were installed, you can run the app.js file by running node app.js. And once that's happening, if you reload, you again got that same app here, like this, so we can still work with that. So it's the same project with different ways of achieving the result, using server-side code for the Node.js project, using front-end JavaScript code for the front-end project, but it's the same app in the end, and it's this demo dummy app which I'm providing to you, which we're going to use to learn about testing. Now I have these different versions of the same app to show you that what you learn about testing will apply to both front-end and back-end JavaScript code, so to browser-side JavaScript code and Node.js JavaScript code, and that it also does not matter whether you're using CommonJS for importing and exporting here on the backend or ES modules. And with that, that is the setup we're going to use for the near future. Not the only setup, not the only code, not the only project we'll see in this course, but it is what we'll use in the next section to get started with the basics of testing.